Hey guys, my name's Khadroth, and today I'm going to be talking to you about our newest writer on JP, Takeda Shingen. So, Takeda Shingen is a very infamous and famous type of character from the Warring States period of Japan. He's coming to us in our newest Gouda event, Gouda 8, which will be a raid event as well as a ladder event. Should be a fairly straightforward event otherwise, but again, there's been some recent hubbub about this new unit. And with regards to that, I've definitely seen people talking about, his middling performance. They think that he's not that good, or maybe they just sort of are obsessed with other characters and, have an axe to grind. I think that's usually the case in most of these cases because I, don't really see anything wrong with Shingen. I think his damage performance is actually pretty good. And in a world in which the devs have said that they pretty much don't want to start giving us Bond 20 yet, I think it makes sense that they're trying to come up with some other units that maybe could act as analogs to other older units that exist. And in Takeda Shingen's case, that's going to be a unit like, say, Francis Drake. So we're going to talk about that, as well as some of the comparisons to other units, and as to how I think Shingen performs, because I don't think he's a bad unit by any means. So, just talking about it again, he is a limited unit. You're only going to be able to get him during the Gouda event that is currently on. Obviously, he will probably get other banners into the future, but just understand that is always the deal with limited units. Unless you roll the actual banner that they're on raid up, don't expect to get them otherwise. You may be able to snipe them off of a GSSR or something like that later on down the line, but obviously availability will be limited. So, with regards to his actual stats and what he is, Takeda Shingen is, as you guys can see, a 5-star AoE Buster Rider, hence the reason for the comparison to Drake. And as a result, we start out here at the beginning by staring at his attack stat. You can see here he's got about 11k attack, 11.1 to be a little bit more precise, almost 11.2. This is not very high, especially not for a 5-star. Certainly we've seen people that, have 10k attack as a 5-star. That's rather on the low end of them. He's not quite there, but he is down there. I do think that would be a potential concern, but the proof is not, really in the pudding here, as again, he's going to end up having his entire kit that really is the factor that you need to pay attention to. So it's not just the attack stat. A high attack stat is always a good thing. A low attack stat is not necessarily a bad thing. It really just depends on how the unit is structured. He does end up having 13.7k HP, so he doesn't really get a whole ton of HP to help offset this, but I think there's a reason why, and you will see that in his kit. I don't think this is a super big concern. I do think that he could have maybe had a little bit more, but it is what it is. His attribute is going to be man attribute. He does have slightly less than average star absorption for a rider, but that's not a huge concern because riders already have some of the highest star absorption in the game. So we don't really have to care too much about him soaking stars. He will soak them nonetheless. His star generation here is also a tad bit low. Again, it's only at 8.9, but it is what it is, and it's nothing too much to be concerned about. He does only have a 0.57 NP charge attack. This maybe could be a little bit higher, but I think you'll see why, and that comes in his kit, not necessarily from his deck of cards, which you can sneak peek there down below. He does have a 3% NP charge defense. This is pretty much right average. We don't really see anyone less than this, but we certainly see a couple people that do have more. It's just as the amount that he's going to get whenever he is hit by an attack. And again, it's per hit of the attack that he will get this number. His death rate here is 38.7%. This is pretty high, so keep him away from anyone that's going to death proc him, but usually those are assassins, so you're probably not going to be running him against them anyways. His alignment is lawful evil, which is a fairly interesting one. Keep in mind, this doesn't necessarily mean that Shingen's evil. It's just what the servant thinks of themselves. But this does mean that he has synergy with other units that can buff evil characters like, say, Doman, or again, maybe someone like, say, Moriarty, who likes to change people to evil. He won't necessarily need anything like that in order to be able to dabble with him. But you can see he is male-gendered. His traits are Genji, so we get yet another Genji unit that you might be able to exploit with someone like Tyra. Hominid, a servant, humanoid, riding, Servant, 7 Night Servant, and weak to Enema Elish. So not too many traits to really write home about, but certainly something there that you could potentially exploit. He does have a triple buster deck, which turns him into a little bit of a gorilla, as we like to call him. People that end up just having the majority of their deck being buster. They're very Oonga Boonga-y. They like to just spam red cards and kind of go. His hit counts are actually all above average at 4 hits, the only exception being the extra attack down here at 5, which is just average. So there's nothing too bad about that. So having above average hits will help smooth out the things like the star generation as well as the NP charge, as this is just going to make the cards sort of help that out. He only has the singular arts and quick cards, so you will still be able to form mighty chains, but it won't be as easy to really NP gain with him with his cards. The good news is, if you are running him, as you probably should be, alongside a Koyanskaya, you can at least get more charge from using those buster cards with her second buff, though it's probably not too huge of a concern, especially since he does have other things to help out with that. Coming down here to his skills, you can see the first part of his kit here is a party-wide charisma of 20%. That in and of itself is strong, but it also has the additional effect of being targetable to reduce one ally's skill cooldowns by 1. Now, you could throw this on other people if you wanted to make a hybrid style comp where he's just one of the damage dealers, but ultimately at the end of the day, I think you're probably going to end up using this on himself quite a bit. Now, Takeda Shingen ends up having 6 turn cooldowns on just about all of his skills, so having the ability to reduce that yet another turn means he ends up having 5 turn cooldowns. And that can actually be really nice, as we've talked about this in the Koyanskaya systems, that this allows skills to be popped on back-to-back turns. So that means you can pop a skill on turn 1 and get it back using Koyanskaya's cooldowns, as well as his own, to basically be able to do this again on turn 2. You might also be able to do it on turn 2 initially, and then get it back in time for turn 3. It just depends on how you set things up, and it is a really nice thing to have. Usually lower cooldowns are almost always better. So definitely a nice little feather in his cap, and yet another unit that does cooldown reduction. So this also alleviates potentially the need to have other units besides Koyanskaya that might do things like this. Taking a look at his second skill here, he increases his own buster performance for 3 turns. This is going to be nice, as again, it's all on the 6 turn cooldown, so if you reduce this to 5 turns, this means you're popping this skill yet again on turns 1 and 2. So you're getting to stack this up faster, allowing you to deal more damage on subsequent turns, basically kind of reaching your peak there already by turn 2, so not too bad. You're going to be able to charge your own NP gauge as well here, though, by 50%. This is an interesting one because it's a little bit odd, because it kind of indicates that you might want to use this on turn 1 in and of itself. Now, I'm not the hugest fan of pairing steroids with charge skills, because it makes you have to make choices sometimes as to like when you use them. Usually this is going to want to make you force out the steroid immediately on turn 1. That's, I guess, fine, but it is at least somewhat of a concern, as you may have been able to manipulate this better had it not been. But at the end of the day, it's still good. He'll still be able to utilize this, so it's not a huge concern. And then on top of that, he will gain 20 crit stars, just giving him an extra nice bomb here. I've actually talked about this with some of our more recent buster units. We're reaching this sort of monopoly money type issue with the buster system, whereas like everybody has crit stars now, so crit stars don't really matter that much. You could have given him 30 here and it really wouldn't have made that big of a difference, because usually you're supported by some of the best supports in the game that also have star bombs in their kit. So both Oberon and Koyanskaya end up having it, thus him having even more certainly doesn't hurt, but it's not really going to make that big of a difference in the grand scheme of things, especially if you just needed to manipulate it in some way to get the crit stars to come out on a certain turn. You usually can be able to do that due to the malleability of the buster comps. But at the end of the day, still better to have it than not. So definitely a nice thing to just have a star bomb there on a low cooldown. And his third skill here is his hard survivability. This is going to grant him invincibility for 3 attacks, 3 turns. So this is why I say, again, I think looking at the HP stat, it's not too huge of a concern. He's going to have that hard survival to be able to like outlast things. The other things you're going to watch out for are things that are maybe going to repeatedly hit him and chip away at these stacks really fast, Anything with invuln pierce, anything with buff removal. Those are going to be the things you're going to want to watch out for because this isn't solemn defense. Things can go through invuln, sadly, but as long as you're careful with that, you should be okay. Then to top that off, he also ends up with a damage cut here of 500. This is not the most robust damage cut, but it's not limited. It is 3 turns, any amount of attacks within 3 turns. So you will get some decent value out of that if he does keep getting hit, but otherwise it's not a terribly strong damage cut. From there, he's also going to increase his own NP generation rate for 3 turns by 30%. So this is going to end up helping out his 0.57 even further. So having that, having the 50% charge here, this is why I say I really don't think this is going to be too big of a concern because he has stuff in his kit to be able to deal with this. So naturally, having additional NP gain, just going to be a nice little extra feather in his cap should he need to try to card. And I do think that could be a concern if you maybe don't have your cooldowns active and you're trying to go the distance with him in more of a challenge scenario, because those triple buster cards can obviously result in some bad sort of setups where you maybe can't get the charge that you want. But again, all of that also on a 6-turn cooldown, so you'd be able to reduce it and double up on it should you need. His passive skills here, he does get Writing A. This is going to help out that quick card performance a little bit, even though he only has the 1. He's going to get Magic Resistance D here for some additional debuff resistance, just making him obviously harder to land any sort of negative effect on him. And then Territory Creation Takeda, a unique variant of Territory Creation here. That's going to still give him Arts up to help his singular Arts cards performance, but it also increases his own critical attack chance resistance by 10%. Just making him ever so slightly harder to crit against. So definitely not too terrible. This will just make him a little bit tankier, a little bit more survivable. Now, here we get to the append skills. I'm just kind of starting off right here with the third one. The third one is anti-ruler attack damage aptitude. Takeda doesn't really have anything special to help him out in this sort of scenario. Probably not your best use of a third append. I'm going to say this one is a very distant third in both, considering both the other appends and how they could matter to him. That being said, he's in a little bit of a weird spot because his second append, mana loading, is usually our go-to recommendation. In Takeda's case, he is a 50% charger. You probably don't care too much to actually have this. Normally, it might matter, especially the example that I can give you where this does matter is where you're using an event CE that's supposed to be a 50% charge CE, but you haven't gotten it to MLB yet. At that point, it's probably only 30% charge, so having the maxed mana loading will help out. But for everything other than that, I do think you're going to be running him alongside 50% CEs to really help him out in his 3-turn scenario. And even in the scenarios where you don't, maybe you're trying to start him from 0 with someone like Kuro, you can do that. You can use a Black Grail on him. It's a little bit convoluted. Party cost will be a concern, but it is possible. The issue at that, though, is that even then, the mana loading's still not necessarily the most ideal setup, because turn 1, you're going to want to pop his charge skill, which is 50%, kind of leaving you that nice, easy segue for another 50% from Koyanskaya right there. So having the mana loading would just sort of erode into the usefulness of that. It's not a bad problem. I'd still say you're safe to get it and unlock it, but it's not going to be super useful like it may be on other units. His extra attack finesse improvement then might be your go-to choice, just depending on what you're up against. Again, like I said, do consider the event CE issue there that you may want the mana loading, but otherwise this is sort of going to be your default because extra attack performance is never a bad thing. It's always decent. It just may not be the best thing for a lot of people's appends. It's definitely going to improve his NP gain, his star generation, 2 things that we maybe had concerns with. So helping that out on the extra attack, I do think is nice, and it will increase the actual damage of it as well, just kind of further helping his card performance. Then we, from here, get to his NP. He has a Buster 8-hit AoE NP. And I think something that's worthy of paying attention to is that it's going to seal all enemies NP for 1 turn, activating first, before the damage goes out. So you're going to be able to seal NPs and make it so that, again, the enemy can't necessarily counter your NP by coming back and just responding immediately in turn. It is nice usually to have a blanket. I don't know why that popped up. It's nice usually to have a blanket like AoE NP seal or skill seal, as it can lock down an entire wave of enemies, and it can definitely be a nice thing to have. But I do think that's at least, you know, neither here nor there. It may be good in sort of servant gauntlet type challenges and stuff where you're a little bit worried about like break bar effects across multiple units, or again, units just using charge skills and stuff like that. But up against, normal fodder and trash and farming and stuff like that, I don't think this is going to be that big of a concern. Obviously, this can still apply to a singular boss in a final wave and stuff like that. So it's definitely better to have it than not. Could be very useful just depending, and especially since you can sort of force a 3-turn. This does mean that you could fundamentally lock down a boss for 3 turns and make it so that they just can't NP. So it is a nice thing as long as the boss doesn't resist it. It would be a very useful tool at being able to lock someone down and stop them from just annihilating you on the back end with an NP. So don't sleep on that NP seal aspect of his kit. He's then from there going to deal damage to all of them and reduce all enemies' quick, arts, and buster resistance activating first for 1 turn. So he does have a damage dealing overcharge. Since this will go out before his damage, this will add to the damage of his NP, giving him an additional 20% buster performance. But the good news is it will stay for the duration of that turn, allowing you to then subsequently card after his NP, which is very likely to be a Buster Brave Chain due to the triple Buster cards in his deck, allowing you to really pop off with subsequent follow-up damage. So I do think that's a really, really nice thing that he has. I did see someone call him a little bit similar to Karna in that regard before, and I do kind of agree with that it is nice to have that sort of follow-up damage. So, as to what CE you're going to want to utilize with Takeda Shingen, obviously cranking is going to be my chief recommendation here. This is a CE that's going to come out next year here on NA. It's from the Bunyan event. If you guys manage to have it still on JP, it is absolutely phenomenal. It is all attack scaling, Buster up, NP damage up, and battle gauge at 50% to begin battle. So really a just stellar performing CE for anyone that needs to start from 50%. It is pretty much your go-to with regards to Buster units. There is also the older aerial drive. This can also really work for you. It is still also all attack scaling. And the reality is it's going to trade basically 2% extra Buster performance against the 5% extra NP damage. It's always kind of a little bit nicer in an Oberon comp to have more NP damage. So cranking does get a little bit of an edge in this battle, but aerial drive was sort of the gold standard for years before cranking and is still very good if you don't manage to have it. This is a permanently available CE nowadays on JP, so there's really no excuse not to get it, as it can really help you. And then from there, you also have another permanent C that's been added here of late, and that's Holy Night Supper, aka Holy Night Dinner. This one is also really solid. This was the gold standard for years at the beginning of the game, pretty much. And you guys can see it's all attack scaling, starting gauge of 50%, NP damage of 15%, and then critical damage of 15%. So a decent all-rounder, not just a one-off NP type of buff. Definitely can be useful down the stretch due to that crit damage. And then there are other ones like Stitching Your Beloved. This was a welfare from the Little Big Tengu event. It is all attack scaling. It also has 15% NP damage and 50% gauge, but then it has critical damage of Buster cards by 20%, so 5% more than Holy Night Supper, but it is specific to Buster cards. Granted, with a unit like Shingen that's got triple Buster deck, I mean, that's still pretty good. He's going to get that quite a bit, so you don't really have to worry about it too much in that regard. Then from there, as I did mention, you could utilize Black Grail. This is going to revolve around you trying to use Kuro in the comp. This is going to be a double Koyanskaya Oberon Kuro comp. You're not going to have very much free party costs. You got to be really careful about the craft essences that you use here. You'll have to use MASH as the 6th unit there in order to reduce cost as much as you can. But the way you're going to want to do this is you're going to want to end up starting out with something like Koyanskaya and Oberon, and then actually end up subbing out the Koyanskaya for Kuro, basically getting her buffs on, and then having Kuro leave the party as of turn 2. that's how you're going to be able to make the charge work, and that should allow him to actually be able to touch Black Grail, which may be useful if you're comparing him to people maybe outside of his niche, like, say, Tiamat, that has recently been out on JP, that obviously has very good damage. So definitely, I think that's going to be a little bit more of a concern. But yes, you don't have to run that. You're not going to want to run that all the time. But the option is there to run that should you just really need more firepower at the expense of everything else. And I do think that is one thing that we can say is good about the Kuro comps, in spite of the fact that they are somewhat convoluted to be able to run. And then, obviously, from there, we can talk a little bit more about his damage. Now, damage has been kind of the main criticism of him. And I want to be clear here. His damage is not bad. We just legitimately have some monsters out there. Now, keep in mind, this is the NP damage list, and this is neutral numbers. This is units under their own power, not including mystic codes, craft essences, or any sort of support character alongside them. So it's just people using their own buffs on themselves against a neutral enemy, so no class effectiveness. Obviously, you have to take these sort of things with a grain of salt. They're very much a vacuum type of scenario, but it is at least interesting for comparative purposes. You can see in such a vacuum, a unit like Iskandar really pops off. However, we know from practicality that Iskandar has no charge, so you can make him 3-turn now with a Kuro comp, but it's not necessarily going to be the easiest thing, nor is it going to do the most damage. That being said, you do have a unit like Ivan the Terrible that has since become a 30% charger. He's now able to start from 50%, just like any other 50%er can. His damage is actually very good, so comparing him to Takeda Shingen is probably a lot more applicable. Same thing with Francis Drake. She's another 50% charging AoE unit. Drake, though, on the other hand, has had some upgrades and has come a long way. So, while Drake does slightly out-edge him pound for pound, Takeda Shingen actually does scale a little bit better than her. It just kind of boils down to she starts with enough of a lead that he doesn't out damage her really, other than on turn 1 of a 3-turn loop. So, you end up in weird scenarios like that. But again, I don't think that's bad. The fact that he's being compared immediately to a unit that has had several upgrades is actually pretty good in that regard. And again, we're not talking about him being all the way down on the list. As you guys can see, he's right here, just south of Santa Altar, who is a welfare. Now, you probably will get Santa Altar here soon, probably from next month's Evocation Festival, assuming they do one. But I can say, even if you don't get her there, you will eventually get her, and her damage is good. The issue that she has is she's somewhat like Iskandar. She just doesn't have charge. So unless they end up giving her an upgrade, I don't think you have too much to worry about there in that regard, as Takeda Shingen will just be a little bit more usable. That's kind of the takeaway from a lot of our units with a lot of charge, is how usable they are. And so to give you guys a little bit of an idea on terms of damage, you guys can see here that basically, with regards to his sort of ideal normal setup, it's going to be 2 times Koyan with an Oberon and a level 100 Cranking and a level 10 Neo Plug Suit. Don't worry if you don't have all of these, it's just for comparative sake. But at MP1 on wave 1, he will end up doing about 52k, and these are neutral numbers as well, just with supports and Mystic codes when applicable. Wave 2, he's going to be doing about 76, almost 77k there. And Wave 3, he's going to end up doing about 182k. So definitely not too bad. You can see the Oberon boost coming in right there in the final wave, but it does happen. Now, comparing to a Europa, on the other hand, another 30% charging unit, Europa's only going to do about 45k on Wave 1, 45k on Wave 2, and then 142k on Wave 3. Europa, I think, is where a lot of people would say she's not bad, but she is kind of in that realm of, hey, now that Drake's had an upgrade, she kind of needs one too, and has kind of for a while. Then you also end up with a unit like Ivan, and I think Ivan's going to be a little bit more the benchmark to compare him against outside of Drake, because Ivan's going to come in at about 72k on Wave 1, 84k on Wave 2, and 237k on Wave 3. So you can see Ivan is going to outscale him a little bit, but Ivan also has some crazy synergy. because again, he probably was never originally meant to be able to 3-turn, and then when they actually enabled it, they went, oh crap, what have we done? And then to round it all off, you've got Drake here at NP1, who's going to come in at about 51k, just barely getting beat by him up here at 52k. Then wave 2, you're going to be looking at 85k in her idyllic setup. And then that's already surpassed him. And then wave 3, you're going to be staring at 213k. So again, only really beat by Ivan at that point, and we kind of already know what Ivan does. Ivan is a little bit of a monster in that regard, but you can see Shingen doesn't stack up too bad. He's outperforming Europa. He's pretty much on par with Drake, and Drake kind of only edges him a little bit by turn 3. And then basically Ivan is still ahead, but that's just kind of how Ivan has been. So I do think there's a little bit of an interesting issue there. But keep in mind he is 50% unit compared to Ivan being only a 30% unit. And there are those scenarios like I talked about with an uncompleted event CE that, you know, Shingen's going to just be able to walk right in and still be able to use potentially. Whereas Ivan's going to go, oh crap, I can't be used in this setup until I end up in some more advantageous situation. So that's something to consider whenever we're considering these units. So that's why I think you're going to see a lot of these comparisons to Drake, because Drake's the other 50%er, and I don't think they're unfair, but I also don't think it means that Shingen is bad. And keep in mind, like we said, that Shingen does have some interesting staying power. He's got that 3 hits, 3 turns of hard invuln there, so definitely a nice thing for him to have. But yeah, I do think Shingen is a decent unit. I don't think he's the most broken unit or anything like that, which, like I said, I think draws some criticisms nowadays, especially on the social media sites, because some people end up saying, you know, like, oh, basically he's not breaking the game, therefore he's not worthy of my attention. I don't think that matters. I think if you like a unit like Shingen, especially if you like his character, especially historically or design-wise, feel free to roll for him. I think you'll be absolutely satisfied with him. He is still a very good unit. If you're worried about his damage, try to pump it up to NP2, but I really don't think it'll be necessary outside of 90++ content, and I think you'll see that just having the proper supports will really help him pop off. So let me know what you guys think about Shingen. Are you guys going to be rolling for him? Which Ascension form is your favorite? Mine personally is the 3rd form. It looks amazing to me, and I'll be curious to hear you guys' thoughts below. I'll see you guys for the next one. Have a good one.